Hello and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video I'm going to be looking at Henry VIII, and in particular I'm going to be looking at key individuals and groups that have an impact on his reign. Obviously Henry himself is a really big character, but there's some other really interesting characters involved in his reign as well. Most of whom are called Thomas, but we will have a look at them and a range of others. So, as I said, I'm going to look at key figures and groups. This is one of the six key areas or key questions that you need to look at. You'll see above me my cat Thomas. Now, Thomas is one of the few Thomases that aren't an important part of Henry's reign. Everybody in his period in time seems to be called Thomas. We are going to look at Thomas Wolsey, Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, and Thomas Cranmer, all of whom are massively important. I'm also going to very briefly look at the 6 wives of Henry VIII. Again, there seems to be a real shortage of names in Tudor England because we've got 6 wives but only 3 names, because we go Catherine and Jane and Catherine. We're going to look at the factions, particularly these factions are particularly important in the 1540s with the Conservative and Reform factions. And I'm going to finish off by looking at the children of Henry VIII. So we've got the legitimate children, Mary, Elizabeth and Edward, and the illegitimate son, Henry FitzRoy, who becomes Duke of Richmond and Somerset when he was 6. So all these characters are going to play a role. So we're going to start off with the Thomases, and the Thomases all play massive roles in the political scene. The first 3 play a massive role in the political scene with Wolsey, More and Cromwell. Cranmer, it's more emphasis on religion, but as we'll see with all of these guys, actually religion and politics in Henry VIII's England kind of cross over into each other. So our first key figure is Thomas Wolsey, who is a really fascinating character. So he was a butcher's son from Ipswich, born around 1472. He got a scholarship to Oxford University and he graduated age 15. This is one of the things I always point out to my students, kind of, what have you been doing? I mean, by the time most students get into sixth form, Wolsey had graduated from Oxford. He is undoubtedly a brilliant organiser, had a brilliant political mind. He made a huge number of enemies amongst the nobility at court. This lowly born butcher's son coming in and telling them all what to do, and we believe from accounts to great joy in lording it over his higher born colleagues. And telling them what to do, and he acted often in a very proud and, we're told, in a very arrogant way. He enjoyed making very overt displays of his wealth. He's said to be very ostentatious. He had about 500 servants. He lived in absolute splendour. His servants were emblazoned with the emblems to show that they worked for him. He loved receiving expensive gifts from Henry in particular. He was very worldly. I think he's probably a better politician than he is member of the clergy. He is renowned for having a mistress and a couple of children, and there's a nasty side of Wolsey as well as a kind of a clever side. There's a vindictive side to him, and probably the best story to illustrate this is the story of Sir Amos Paulet, someone who had crossed Wolsey when he was a young priest, and Wolsey exacted his revenge, and he summoned Paulet to the court of the Chancery in London for 5 years on the trot, every day on trumped up charges and a case that was never heard. And essentially this completely bankrupted Paulet because he couldn't get on with anything else, because every day he had to turn up at the court Chancery and then be told, no, your case has not been heard today. And so quite a nasty move, and Wolsey would go for those who he felt were against him and those he felt he could exact power on. And he was definitely no friend of the nobility. Now he is argued to have been a great a friend of the poor, and that might well be because of his humble beginnings. He got into Henry's court and would shown himself as a good organiser, distributing arms to the poor. And he got his first big job in 1512, which was organising the expedition to France, which happened the following year. and brought Henry some of the glory that he was after. I mean, Henry wanted to be a warrior king. He wanted to defeat the French, and actually Wolsey's brilliant organisational skills helped him do this. His reward for this, in 1513, he's made Bishop of Tournai, and he's also Dean of York. A year later, becomes also Bishop of Lincoln and Archbishop of York, as again he seems to be just mounting up these endless kind of offices in the church, and therefore again is seen as a bad example of what's going on with the clergy at the time, where again with this idea of absenteeism and building of offices just to generate money. In 1515 he became Cardinal and Lord Chancellor, which is effectively First Minister at this point. He did have a humiliating moment in 1515, despite all these great glories he was getting, where he had to beg forgiveness from Parliament on the Hume case, where this guy had died in the prison of the Bishop of London, having refused to pay for the burial of his infant son, and the church again was looking quite bad at this point, and Wolsey it was the guy who had to beg forgiveness on his hands and knees in front of Parliament. In 1516 he starts his legal reforms, and it was these legal reforms which championed the poor over the wealthy, and again gives him this kind of title of defender of the poor. A lot of them were dependent on him actually being in place and kind of weren't long lasting, but it definitely started a big movement in terms of consolidation of common law. He started a national inquiry into enclosure and the ills caused by enclosure in 1517. He became papal legate in 1518 and pulled off one of his greatest triumphs, which was the Treaty of London. 1520 helps organise the Field of Cloth of Gold, where Henry meets with the King of France, and they manage to display their wealth and even get involved in a wrestling match. But that kind of staved off war with France, but not for very long, because in 1522 there was war with France, and Wolsey also carried out a national survey to see who could pay tax and how much tax. It was the biggest since the Domesday Book of 1086, and he then managed to generate 200 grand's worth of forced loans for Henry, again showing his effectiveness as First Minister. In 1523 he becomes Bishop of Durham, and he also calls Parliament to raise taxes to pay for Henry's expensive foreign policy. Again, he's rewarded again by the Pope in 1524. He's given even greater powers as papal legate. In 1525 he tries to generate Henry more money with the amicable grant, but this goes quite badly wrong, and it's quite humiliating for Wolsey, and therefore humiliating also for Henry, and Wolsey's power is completely dependent on him keeping favour with Henry, and this is a really important part of Wolsey's career, because without Henry's favour Wolsey is nothing. So he's raised to all these great honours and positions that I've been talking about. But if he loses Henry's favour, then this could all be gone in the click of the fingers. In 1526, to try and solve this financial crisis caused by the expensive foreign policy, he carries out recoinage, which is actually debasing the coinage, taking some of the precious metal out of it. In 1527, his attempts to get Henry a divorce carries on, and he seems to go into this very half-heartedly. He tries the scriptural arguments in terms of what was said in the Bible about marrying your brother's widow. There's a diplomatic approach where he tries to apply pressure, and there's the legal approach as well. So he tries a variety of methods. Now Anne Boleyn is never convinced that Wolsey is really on the side of her and Henry, and that essentially he's caught between his two bosses. His two bosses are Henry and the Pope. Life is made very difficult for Wolsey, because actually Charles V is in charge of the Pope at this stage, really, and is not going to allow his relative to get a divorce from the King of England. He finally holds a divorce case in England in 1529, which ends up not getting to anything. Catherine refuses to accept the court and demands that the case be heard in Rome, and the Pope agrees. And then he is accused of praemunire, which essentially is placing the Pope ahead of the King. and he falls from power. Now he is going to see the king, and there was a possibility that he could maybe have talked Henry round, as he talked Henry round on many things through his career, but he dies en route. And so Wolsey is a really dominant figure from 1512 to 1529 in Henry's reign, and really, really important in helping Henry achieve the things that he wanted, and also showing this idea that those of not of high birth can become key figures in both church and state. And Wolsey definitely wielded a huge amount of power, made quite a lot of enemies whilst he was doing it, and those enemies sprung as soon as they saw a moment of weakness with what was happening with the divorce, and never actually having Anne Boleyn on side was a massive problem for him. The next is the next Thomas of ours is going to be Thomas More. He was born in 1478. He was a scholar, a humanist, and he opposed key things that were happening at this point in time. He opposed the growth of enclosure, which was bringing great suffering to the poor, and he opposed Protestantism, which he saw as a great evil. He was, I guess I said, he was a scholar, he was a writer. He was working on a history of the reign of Richard III in 1513, which turned out to be brilliant kind of Tudor propaganda, as it talked about the tyranny of Richard III and all the bad things that he's done. In 1516 he published Utopia, which is a great humanist work, which kind of it compares life on earth into how it should be if you had a more perfect society. In 1528 he conducted heresy trials against the Lutherans. He clashed with Anne Boleyn over all of this. In 1529, he replaced Wolsey as Lord Chancellor. So Wolsey's fall, so we lose one Thomas and we gain another. In 1531, he carries out further persecutions of Protestants. Again, so we start to see that in terms of the Reformation, he's pushing in a different direction to how things are going. Now, I think actually in terms of doctrine, he was probably very close to Henry, really. But in terms of the actions that Henry was carrying out with the church, he couldn't go along with what Henry was doing. He resigned in 1532 in protest against this act of submission of the clergy, where Henry was forcing the clergy to accept the changes to the church and the marriage and the divorce. And in 1534 he refused to take an oath recognising the divorce and recognising Anne as queen. In 1535 he was convicted of treason, and it was on very, very flimsy evidence. And the key bit came the word of Richard Rich, who was played a key role in the dissolution of the monasteries and was one of Cromwell's men. And this brought down Thomas More. So More is not necessarily, well, he's not in high office for very long. He was influential as a thinker, as a writer, and is renowned as a martyr who died for his beliefs. Our next Thomas is my favourite Thomas of these Thomases, is Thomas Cromwell. So Thomas Cromwell is really quite remarkable. He was born in Putney around 1485, very humble beginnings. His father, according to different accounts, was possibly a blacksmith we're not sure whether he had multiple jobs at multiple times. He ran an ale house or worked in an ale house for a period of time. He definitely had a reputation for violence. Cromwell, again, by Cromwell's own admission, was a bit of a ruffian as a youth, and something happened when he was a teenager, which meant that he needed to leave London and he needed to go and make his way somewhere else. And so he headed out, first of all, to the Netherlands whilst he was a teenager, and then further on into Italy. He believed that actually most of the work that he did in the period when he was away was that of a mercenary soldier. He also learns about business and diplomacy, particularly when working for a Venetian merchant. And he was also said to have picked up political ideas and also religious ideas when he was on his travels. So this is a guy who's come from virtually nothing and has learned about the world by travelling and working and doing things the hard way. In 1516 he returned to England and married, and he also at that point started working for Woolsey. And by 1519 he gained a fairly senior position in Wolsey's household. He went on to study law at the Inns of Court and went on to develop a successful legal practice. So here we're seeing Wolsey on the up and up. sorry, Cromwell on the up and up with the support of Wolsey. So Cromwell then became an MP in 1529, and he used his platform as an MP to attack the abuses of the church, and this caught Henry's attention, because obviously this is a key moment in time in terms of the Great Matter and the break with Rome. In 1531 he became a member of the Royal Council, and in 1532 took over the King's divorce, again using his legal skills. And Thomas Cromwell was a man who just got stuff done, and I think that's really what appealed to, first of all, Wolsey, and then subsequently to Henry. He became Master of the King's Jewels in 1532, which gave him frequent access to the King, and his influence continued to grow. In 1533 he became Chancellor of the Exchequer, so he had control of finance, and also Master of the Rolls, which gave him key control in the legal system. 2 years later he became Vicar General, and therefore was in charge of reforming the church, something again we can go back 6 years and say it's something that starts his political career, and therefore he's going to play a massive role in things like dissolution. In 1536 he became Lord Privy Seal and Principal Secretary, and also was elevated to the position of Baron Cromwell. And in 1540, which was actually the year of his execution, he became Lord Great Chamberlain and Earl of Essex. So all of this suggests that right until the end, Henry was promoting him. Cromwell had made his name and gained favour by getting Henry the divorce that he wanted, and he'd done this in a slightly odd way in proving, in inverted commas, that English kings were emperors, not bound by papal control, and he got kind of various bits from old English myth and legend and old bits of law to kind of prove the case on this, and he put it all together and presented it and said, look, Henry, you don't need the Pope's permission. Actually, you are rightfully in charge of absolutely everything, so you should be head of church. He also then went on to remove Anne Boleyn when Henry wanted to get rid of Anne Boleyn, but his career kind of fell apart, or Cromwell's position fell apart due to, well, again, area of marriage and failure to please Henry. So having removed wife number 1 and then wife number 2, it was in his proposal of wife number 3 and of Cleves that eventually led to his downfall, because Henry wasn't happy with Anne of Cleves, and she didn't look like her portrait, and it all goes horribly wrong. Thomas at the top can't watch at this point. There was also suspicion about his religious beliefs, and again, there's lots of evidence suggests that Cromwell genuinely was a Protestant, whilst Henry, although wanting the divorce and the power that the split of Rome and gave him, and the money the dissolution of the monasteries gave him, didn't share Cromwell's Protestant leanings. Now, Cromwell certainly had a huge impact, involving the split with Rome, the dissolution of the monasteries, the provoking of the Pilgrimage of Grace, and again, in which he was the great hate figure of those rebels in the north. He is argued by some to have carried out a revolution in government and brought about massive changes in the way that England was governed, in the role of Parliament, in the power of the king. He was a very divisive figure, despised by the nobility at court for his low birth, for his uniquely powerful position and influence over the king. He sought vengeance again, a bit like Wolsey, but this time he sought vengeance against those who brought down his old master. He is a key figure in this new breed of professional administrators that we see emerging during the Tudor period. He was a modernizer. So this is different to the kind of medieval methods of government where we see great members of the nobility in all the key positions. This is a guy from a poor background in Putney who's raised up to become the second most powerful man in England. So some see him as the most brilliant political mind of his age. Others see him as a tyrant who broke and bent the law to achieve Henry and his own aims, and you kind of pay your money and take your choice on that one. I'm a big Cromwell fan. I think he's a really interesting and remarkable character, but definitely not without his flaws, and definitely not someone you'd have wanted to be on the wrong side of. And you can probably ask the likes of Thomas More about that. Another Thomas is Thomas Cranmer, and Cranmer was born in 1489. He joined the White Horse group at Cambridge in the 1520s that discussed and looked into Lutheranism and the other new religious ideas coming across from Europe. Now, he never became a committed Lutheran. Actually, he had a really interesting take on religion, did Cranmer, where essentially he bowed to the wishes of whoever was monarch. So we think he had Protestant leanings, and we definitely see this particularly in the reign of Edward, and we see it towards the end of the reign of Henry. But he was always willing to swing in whatever direction Henry was going at the time. He'd been chaplain to Anne Boleyn's father. He wrote a defence of the king's divorce. And he was rewarded from this. In 1532, became Archbishop of Canterbury, which is fairly unique because he hadn't really held any senior positions in the church before, and then he's jumped right to the highest position in England. In 1533, he authorised the Act of Restraints of Appeals, which stopped Catherine appealing to the Pope over the issue of divorce. He supported the publication of the Bible in English, a key kind of Protestant aim, so we can see some Protestant leanings there. But he put loyalty to Henry above all else, and so when much more strongly Catholic policy was put forward, such as the accepting the 6 Articles and accepting the persecution of Lutherans, then Cranmer stood loyal to Henry, whilst other Protestants resigned and pulled away. So he then was a key member of the Reform faction during the 1540s. He goes on to write Protestant prayer books under Edward in 1549 and 1552, and then is burned alive by Mary in 1556, despite having renounced Protestantism. I think it's 5 times he renounces it in the case that's held against him. But despite that, Mary still burns him alive, and famously he thrust his writing hand into the fire and said that it should burn first because it had sinned the most in his recanting of his Protestantism. Now we're going to move on to the wives, none of whom are called Thomas, so we're getting a slight change in names. So we're going to start with Catherine of Aragon. So Catherine of Aragon lived 1485 to 1536. She was daughter of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. Now, she first married Arthur in 1501, but he died 5 months later, and she remained in England. 8 years later, in 1509, she married Henry shortly after him becoming king. He was 17, she was 24 at this point in time. She played a really important role in the early years of Henry's reign, and definitely we believe that Henry and Catherine were in love, and a lot of the bitterness and stuff is going to come later. You don't see huge traces of early on in their marriage. She plays a really important role in 1513 as she acted as a regent for 6 months whilst Henry was off fighting the French, again with his great ambition to do so. And during that regency, the forces essentially under her direction defeated the Scots at the Battle of Flodden, and that this is possibly one of the greatest military victories of Henry VIII's reign. But Henry VIII is in France at the time, and Catherine is the regent in charge. She had lots of pregnancies and gave birth to multiple children, but only one survived, which is Mary, who was born in 1516. She was aunt to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was undoubtedly the most powerful man in Europe at this point in time. And when Henry became infatuated with Anne Boleyn, Catherine refused to give him a divorce. And she stood up for herself in the trial in 1529, demanding that the case be heard in Rome, defending not only her position but the position of her daughter, and denying that the court had any jurisdiction or any right to try her. Following the divorce, she became focus of a faction, or during the Great Massacre, she became focus of a faction that wanted to see Mary as heir and opposed religious change, often referred to as the Aragonese faction. So she gathered support around her, and therefore was a potential problem for Henry, particularly because of the support for her and for her daughter by Charles V. Anne Boleyn is the second wife. She lived 1501 to 1536. She was the daughter of Sir George Boleyn, and was related to the Howards, who were Earls of Norfolk. She spent time as a child at the French court. Infamously, her sister was said to have had an affair with Henry VIII back in 1520. Henry is said to have fallen for her in 1525, but she refused to act like her sister had done and be a mistress, and would only accept being a wife. And she supported religious reform, hated Wolsey, who she blamed for not getting the divorce sorted more quickly, and is portrayed by many historians as a completely dominating character. She's said to be very intelligent, very articulate, and have wrapped Henry seemingly around her little finger during this period. Now that power she has over Henry soon fades. She gives birth to Elizabeth in 1533, but fails to produce a son. This kind of intoxicating, domineering personality that Henry had been infatuated was when he was pursuing her seems to become less attractive to him as the characteristics in a wife. She was accused of multiple accounts of adultery, including incest with her own brother, as well as affairs with the musician Mark Smeaton and multiple others. And she was executed for this and for treason in 1536. Historians are always quite puzzled by this ending in terms of lots of people absolutely doubt this evidence and these accusations could possibly be true. And then the other side of it is why, if it wasn't, would Henry VIII put him through the humiliation of all of this and the trial? And I think, as some people are, essentially he told Cromwell to kind of get rid of her by any means necessary, and these were the means that they found. And very quickly, she is replaced by Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour lived 1508 to 1537. She had served as both Catherine and Anne's maid of honour, one of her maids of honour or ladies in waiting. She married Henry just days after Anne Boleyn's execution in 1536. She seems to have been a very different character to the first two very formidable wives that Henry had, who were very kind of strong and vibrant personalities. She lacked their education. She was conservative in all kinds of ways. She was socially conservative. She didn't like the outlandish dress. She liked the kind of the parties and the music and everything that would be seen in the house of Anne Boleyn. She was politically conservative. She wanted mediation, and she wanted she didn't want kind of extreme actions. And religiously, we think she was quite conservative as well. And in that, she played a key role in reconciling Henry with his daughter Mary and bringing her back into court. And she was also sympathetic to Henry's first wife, Catherine. She died in 1537 following giving birth to Edward, and so she succeeds in a way that none of Henry's other wives do in giving him what he absolutely wanted, which was a male heir. Her brothers Edward Seymour and Thomas Seymour would both go on to play key roles in the story of the Tudors, in the lives of her son, their nephew Edward, but also in the lives of Henry's daughters. And Edward would go on to be a key leader in the Reform faction, which I'll look at shortly. The next wife is Anna Cleves. There is a short break, actually, for Henry of a couple of years. So Anna Cleves lived 1515 to 1557. The marriage was a strategic one. Cromwell sought a Protestant alliance to counter the Catholic threat of the major European powers of the Holy Roman Empire in Spain and France. And Anna Cleves was the daughter of the Duke of Cleves, who was part of what was now Germany. And Henry was sold on the idea, having seen a portrait of Anne of Cleves, and this is, as I often say to my class, one of the potentially the first cases of catfishing, where Henry sees the portrait and goes, "Wow, she's gorgeous," and then she turned up, and I don't think Henry was very subtle about this. Kind of was deeply disappointed and went essentially, ugh, and referred to him as it was angry at Cromwell having brought him an ugly wife. The marriage lasted for about 6 months. She was given the title King's Sister, and she was financially well looked after, and she can see she substantially outlived Henry as well. So this marriage, it seemingly would be a very little consequence. It's not consummated, it doesn't last very long, but it is significant because it plays a massive role in the fall of Cromwell. So Cromwell, in getting Henry what he wants and pleasing him, has had an incredibly successful career, and it's at this point in 1540 where he falls foul of that, and very quickly after all of this he falls completely and is executed. The next wife is Catherine Howard. Now, Catherine Howard lived 1523 to 1542, and if your maths is any good at all, then you'll notice that is a very short life. She'd been lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves and had caught Henry's eye. She was the niece of the Duke of Norfolk, who was an enemy of Cromwell and the leader of the Conservative faction who wanted to prevent religious reform. She married Henry almost immediately after the divorce to Anne of Cleves in the summer of 1540. She was 19 and by all accounts a very, very attractive, captivating young woman. Henry was 48, overweight, barely able to walk, not really a great prize for an attractive 19-year-old, other than the fact that he was king. Henry was absolutely besotted with her and showered her with gifts. I mean, the implication of all this then is I don't think that Catherine Howard was particularly besotted with Henry, and no son arrived. And there were soon allegations of adultery, including with Thomas Culpeper, and relations with other men before her marriage, including Francis Dereham. And there was potentially contract to marriage between her and Francis Dereham before she married Henry. And all of this emerged. And she was executed in 1542. Interestingly, historians are a lot less sympathetic to her plight in actually the allegations, and I think most historians seem to see more truth in the allegations made against her than they do in the allegations made against Anne Boleyn. But again, there is a lot of sympathy for her in terms of a young woman who's essentially been used in a political game by her uncle to essentially capture the heart of this fat old man with a gammy leg and manipulate him in terms of religious changes and things like that. Perhaps as she was foolish in the way that she acted, but obviously this results in again a brutal execution. The final wife is another Catherine, is Catherine Parr. She lived 1512 to 1548, so she outlives Henry. She was a highly intelligent woman who wrote some really important works about religion and religious reform. She helped get Elizabeth restored to the succession, and Elizabeth lived with her following Henry's death. And so this role as kind of stepmom to Henry's kids was a really important one. She was a part of the Reform faction and survived accusations against her by the Conservative faction as Henry took her side over theirs. After Henry's death, she actually married Thomas Seymour, the younger brother of Jane Seymour, and died due to complications linked to childbirth. Before that, Catherine had actually sent Elizabeth away after allegations of an affair between Elizabeth, who was about 14 at the time, and Thomas Seymour, who was in his 40s, and it's all very horrible. So that's it, again, an important part of the story going forward in terms of the story of Elizabeth. So Catherine Parr was a calming influence on Henry in his later years, and helped steer England in the direction towards reform, which is going to be really important when her stepson Edward comes to the throne following Henry's death. So these key factions at court then, well, the first of these, and again most of this stuff is concentrated in the 1540s. I mean, in the earlier bits you've normally got the kind of the Wolsey faction, the anti-Wolsey faction, the More faction, and the Cromwell faction, the pro-Cromwell and anti-Cromwell factions, and so on. Now, the Conservative faction comes out of the anti-Cromwell faction, and so they opposed further move towards Protestantism following the break with Rome. Key figures were Thomas Howard, who was Duke of Norfolk, and Stephen Gardiner, who was Bishop of Winchester. So some key achievements of theirs were the Six Articles in 1539, which was essentially Catholic doctrine, and really they should have had some massive things in their favour. So Henry essentially doctrinally was Catholic, and they get the Six Articles through. They bring down Cromwell in 1540. Henry then marries Catherine Howard, who was the niece of the Duke of Norfolk. But it then all starts to unravel, because obviously the marriage to Catherine Howard doesn't last. They plotted against Cranmer in 43, and that failed. They plotted against Catherine Parr in 1546, and that failed. And really, they were unable to get people into key positions into the King's Privy Chamber and onto the council, and key positions like Grimmer's Stool, which was tended in the later years to be held by members of the Reform faction. So the Conservative faction, again, is an important part of the story in the later years of Henry's reign, and we see him kind of flying a bit backwards and forwards between these two factions. But ultimately, it's the faction that loses. The faction that wins is the Reform faction. They wanted further Protestant reform. Now, it's not the same that they brought about loads of further Protestant reform in the 1540s. They don't. But what they do manage to do is they secure the succession. They secure the direction that England is going to go afterwards, and they're the ones that are in positions of strength and power at the end, whilst the Conservative faction are essentially either marginalised or in prison or dead. So key figures are Edward Seymour, Thomas Cranmer, Sir William Paget, and Anthony Denny. Now, Denny controlled the dry stamp from 1546, which was very important because essentially he could make law, and Catherine Parr as well. So some key events. Well, Seymour, again, standing because commanding English armies against the Scots. The fall of Catherine Howard was really important, and this meant that plots against Gardiner in 1544 was successful, and against Norfolk in 1546, which resulted in Norfolk's arrest, was successful, and this ensured that the Reform faction commanded court. Denny became Chief Gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber, gave him control of access to a largely immobile old king. So if you had to get past Denny to get to the king, and therefore we see the Reform faction with access to the king and the Conservative faction without. Edward Seymour was able to make himself Lord Protector following Henry's death, and to steer his nephew Edward through the first couple of years of his reign until everything goes horribly wrong in 1549. I'm now going to go through Henry's children. Obviously, there's parts of this are about what happens in Henry's reign, and part of this is then taken us into the next part of the story. So Mary was born in 1516. She lived till 1558. She was a sickly child. She was devoted to her Catholic faith and also to her mother, which obviously leads to difficulties with her father, with the whole thing with the Great Matter. She defied her father and later her brother in religious matters, knowing she had the protection of Charles V, and therefore, although she might be taken out of the succession, and though she might be kind of marginalised and sent out from court, then no great harm should come to her because of the potential consequences of that for Henry and then later Edward. She became queen in 1553, despite her brother's attempts to stop that happening. She married Philip of Spain, the son of Charles V, in 1554, and she gains the reputation, rightly or wrongly, as Bloody Mary for burning Protestants at the stake. Again, hardly unique in the Tudor history in killing lots of people she disliked. And she died in 1558, was believed of a cancerous tumour. And she had a phantom pregnancy, but we actually think it was a tumour, and that was what's killed her. And she was then succeeded by her sister Elizabeth. Now, the second child is one that you won't necessarily see in all the books and stuff, which is Henry FitzRoy, Duke of Richmond and Somerset. He was born in 1519 and died in 1536. He was the illegitimate son of Henry VIII and Elizabeth Blount. Thomas Wolsey was his godfather, and he was actually acknowledged by his father. Now, we believe that Henry had multiple other illegitimate children, but what makes Henry FitzRoy different is that he's actually acknowledged by his father. He was brought to court in 1525 when he was aged 6 and made Duke of Richmond and Somerset. He was given a lot more honours following this, including being made Lord Lieutenant of Ireland in 1529. In 1533, he married Lady Mary Howard, who was the daughter of the Duke of Norfolk. Now, the marriage was not consummated. Now, some weird stuff around this. This was directly under orders from the king. Now, some part of it makes good sense. The husband and wife were both about 14 at the time of the marriage, and part of this would believe that Henry believed that stuff like this was related to his brother's death, Arthur, and so he ordered them not to consummate the marriage until they were both of age. But it never got to that point because Henry died in 1536. Now, again, this therefore makes what ultimately would have happened in terms of succession, and where Henry FitzRoy would have fitted in the succession and any potential power struggle amongst Henry's children, a kind of a moot point because he dies in 1536. If he'd still been alive in 1547, then things may well have been very, very different in terms of the rest of the Tudor period. The next of the children is Elizabeth, who was born in 1533 and lives all the way through to 1603. She had a very difficult early life, cut off from the line of succession. I mean, life's not going to be great when you're a toddler and dad executes mum, and therefore she's kind of, with all the horrendous accusations against her mother, that kind of besmirches the reputation of Elizabeth as well. She's educated by Protestant tutors. She's brought back into favour by Catherine Parr. Life does not, again, remain easy. There's the scandal with Thomas Seymour when she's living with Catherine Parr. She's also imprisoned by her sister following Wyatt's rebellion. But she goes on to become queen in 1558 and is one of our longest ever reigning monarchs. She rules from 1558 to 1603, so I think that only puts her behind our current Elizabeth and Victoria. So a really important monarch later on, but one who actually in the reign of her father has a very difficult and maybe slightly delicate position, and we believe actually from the stuff that she idolized her father and wanted to carry on his legacy and his work, and she definitely could be as brutal and as strong as her father was before her. Final one of Henry's children then is Edward, who was born in 1537 and lived to 1553. He became king in 1547 whilst he was still only 9. He was the godson of Thomas Cranmer. He was an absolute devout Protestant zealot, if you like, was determined to complete the Reformation in England and create a truly Protestant nation, despite the fact that most of the people were still Catholic. His uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, who'd led the Reform faction, was Lord Protector of his until 1549, but Somerset fell following 2 rebellions, Kepp's Rebellion and the Western Rebellion in 1549, and was replaced by John Dudley, who became Duke of Northumberland, though Dudley never took the title of Lord Protector. He tried to prevent his Catholic sister Mary from becoming queen, instead passed a device which passed the throne to Lady Jane Grey, and she reigned for only 9 days. Well, again, a fairly epic look at a load of people called Thomas, and then some other people called Catherine and Anne, and then Henry's children, and a bit of faction. So there are hopefully lots of good examples and detail in here to help you understand some of the key characters that you might be asked to look at when examining Henry VIII's reign, and it's definitely some really, really interesting ones in there, not least Henry's wives, and again, particular favourites of mine, the 2 Thomases, Wolsey and Cromwell in particular. Thank you very much for watching. This is part of my playlist on Tudor England, which is designed for A-level students studying the AQA Unit 1C, and I'm looking at the key questions for all the different Tudor monarchs. The playlist now has everything, has a whole range of videos on Henry VII and Henry VIII, and a growing number looking at Edward, Mary and Elizabeth as well. So hopefully something that will be really useful for you in your studies and your revision, and then also of interest to anybody else who is just interested in the Tudor period, which is a fascinating one. There are a whole series of other playlists on my channel that look at different bits of history, and also a very wide range of subjects on politics as well, on A-level politics. So hopefully plenty on the channel that will make it worth subscribing for you. Thank you very much for watching.